when I started working in the media industry, I started off at CBS Radio, which is very much like traditional news. And I was depressed. I was there for about 6 months before I realized, oh my God, the best that I could ever do in an environment like this is work my way up to being an anchor. And the anchors would come in like 10 minutes before the broadcast and just regurgitate what was written for them. And I found that so boring. There was no mental stimulation involved. I just hated it. And one day, one of my colleagues there came up to me and asked, are you interested in doing this temp job for 2 weeks? It's for a new show called The Young Turks. And I was like, The Young Turks, what is that? And I asked a bunch of questions about the name. And once I realized what the show was about, I was like, all right, it's 2 weeks. I'm going to go to Europe for a month. First time I'm traveling out of the country. I could use the money. Why not? So I go in there. And on the very first day, Cenk Uygur comes in. He's like rushing in. He's super late. He's got a bunch of papers in his hands. I'm like, oh my God, look at this guy. So unprofessional. What am I doing here? I'm glad it's only going to be 2 weeks. But then he sits down and he just starts railing against the Bush administration and their preemptive war in Iraq. And remember, this is at a time when the news wasn't really telling the truth about how much of a disaster that war was, how much of a disaster our war crimes were. We were committing war crimes. The Bush administration was. And it just felt so refreshing to see someone give the audience the facts about what was happening on the ground, but also just tell the truth about how much this is going to lead to backlash toward the United States, how counterproductive this is. And I just really appreciated that. So once I saw how he conducted himself and how he was telling the audience what the reality was, I didn't want to leave. And eventually, things kind of came to a head because the company was in dire straits, financially speaking. We were carried on something called Air America Radio. That's where the majority of the revenue was coming from at that time. And so Air America had gone bankrupt. At this time, I'm working both jobs. I'm still at CBS because that's the stable job. I love TYT, but it's not so stable, and it might go under any minute because of Air America going bankrupt. And Cenk calls me into his office. I'll never forget this day. I remember it so vividly. He just tells me, listen, I need you to quit CBS. And I was like, oh, okay, but looks like TYT's in trouble. You guys might go under. I'm like, what happens if I quit my stable job, work at TYT, and you guys go bankrupt? And he's like, well, that's life in the big city. And apparently that one line was persuasive enough for me to quit my job at CBS.
Sold.
Yeah. And it was the best decision I made. I mean, it was a risk at the time, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. But I realized that I was so unhappy with what my future would have been if I stayed at CBS that I just decided to take that risk and figure it out from there.
And look what you guys have done now. The two of you guys. It's amazing. Great story. Thank you for sharing your story. I think it's the best transition into the story that came out yesterday. Americans' trust in media plummets to a historic low. Okay, so this is an Axios story. Americans' trust in media has fallen to a historic low. According to new polling from Gallup, trust in media has previously dropped to 32% in 2016 before rebounding slightly. Those gains have essentially been wiped out according to the poll. Only 32% of the population reports having a great deal or a fair amount of confidence that the media reports the news in full, fair, and accurate way. The only other time in recent history that trust had fallen to 32% was in 2016. In some cases, the sentiment is worse today. Record high number of Americans, 39% said they don't trust the media at all. That number has steadily increased since 2018. Much of the sentiment dip is driven by Democrats and independents whose collective trust in media has plummeted 18 and 13 percentage points, respectively, from their 2018 peaks. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that the polarization that we're experiencing with the American electorate is reflected in how the media conducts itself. I think depending on what you're watching, you will get only half of the story. So I think that's definitely true of some of the more new media outlets, independent outlets. They cater to a very specific portion of the audience, very specific portion of the electorate. And I think Americans are increasingly realizing, okay, I might be in an ideological bubble depending on what kind of news I'm consuming. So you have that. Then on a more corporate level, if you want to put it that way, corporate media, legacy media, I mean, they've gotten so many things wrong over the years. And I think that all of those mistakes add up in people's minds and it leads to distrust. So look, I'll give you an example that I think you guys are probably definitely going to agree with. But then I'll also talk about it in the context of some of the stories that I got wrong because I relied on legacy media. So in the lead up to the Mueller report, if you were consuming the New York Times, NBC, if legacy media was what you relied on for your information, you were under the impression that without question, the Mueller report will prove that Donald Trump had colluded. There was a big conspiracy between Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Russia. The report did not bear that out. And it was just, I just felt like I was misled by a lot of that reporting. I felt like a sucker for buying that reporting. So that already was like a major hit when it came to my trust in corporate media or legacy media. Then I saw the way they treated Cenk Uygur when he ran for Congress. The lies they told about him were outrageous. And I was like, oh my God. I don't know what to believe from them if they are willing to literally take an interview he did with David Duke. That was a super heated interview. Cenk was not friendly to him. I mean, they took a sarcastic comment that Cenk made in the context of that interview, and they reported it as if he was like he wasn't sarcastic, like he meant what he said. And you go back and you watch that interview, you watch that statement, and you're like, no, it's very obvious he's being sarcastic here. So you start losing trust as these, I don't even want to say mistakes. I feel like in some cases, some reporters have an agenda and their agenda becomes clear in their misreporting.
Intentional.
Now, I don't think that's always the case. I don't think that's the case the majority of the time. But when I look at the stories that I got wrong during the COVID era, right, and mostly culture war related stories, it's because the media intentionally, and I'm going to say intentionally, omitted incredibly important details of those various controversial stories. The Kyle Rittenhouse story, perfect example of that. I got that story wrong because I relied on corporate media. And look, I have to hold myself accountable, so I'm not saying that to place blame or transfer the blame onto others. I should have done my due diligence and I should have gone out of my way to read from reporters that might have a different perspective. I didn't do that. And now I've learned to really go out of my way to understand the arguments made on all sides. But if you are relying on one news source, or if you are under the impression that the media outlets that have been around forever are the most credible, the most legitimate, and the most accurate, you will be misled. You really do have to have a healthy, diverse media diet in order to get a better grasp on what's happening in the country and in the world.
And you made a great point, and you mentioned it was like right with the Trump and all that. Can you bring that chart back up, Rob? Notice how in 2016, Donald Trump, the election, where's that? You have that. Look at 2016, Rob. Look at that drop that Republicans are like, we know that they were lying, but look at how Democrats.
You're showing this so the audience knows the red is Republican, the red is blue is a Democrat, and the dot is independent.
So independents kind of gradually went down, Anna. But notice the Republicans knew that they were full of crap. But isn't that crazy? Democrats were like, oh my God, we love they're telling the truth about Trump and everything. And then look at it's still slowly, gradually dropping down to 58%. But it's crazy how that moment in time, the 2016, that election, the Trump and everything. It was like right when he said fake news, people were like, yeah, whatever, he's full of crap. But look at that.
And whose data is this? Whose report is this? Who's the source?
I don't know, but
is this like an independent survey?
I know Gallup just put out a survey.
Because, Pat, my understanding is if you take out sports scores and weather, this is actually zero.
Yeah. For Democrats.
No, media.
Yeah,
trust in media. If you take out sports scores and weather, it's actually zero.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Got it.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.